Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce David Rubenstein. Most of you probably have seen his television show, so he doesn't need much of an introduction. In the early 1950s, Isaiah Berlin wrote an essay about Tolstoy called The Hedgehog and the Fox, which was based on a line from a Greek poet from the classical era, that the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. And then the question for Berlin was whether Tolstoy was a fox or a hedgehog, and the question is whether David Rubenstein is a fox or a hedgehog. So he might be a fox because he really knows everything. He knows how to get pandas to mate, and he knows how to buy the Magna Carta. I mean, who knows how to do that? Do you say, I've heard him say, you just say at a dinner party, excuse me, I need to go buy the Magna Carta. And people think you're joking and they let you go. And he knows how to get the rate of inflation up to 18%. Who can do that? Well, he did that working for President Carter. But you might say he's a hedgehog because he knows one big thing, and that thing is his gratitude to the promise and the idea of America. David Rubenstein.
So David, thank you for those kind words. And David, as you probably know, is finishing his last month or so as the Dean of the Duke Law School. I served as chairman of the board at Duke for a number of years, and David was a spectacular dean. 11 years as dean, increased the ratings of the law school, increased almost everything about the law school. Percentage of people get clerkships, percentage of people employed, percentage of people who passed the bar the first time. Almost every statistic was terrific. So thank you very much for what you've done, David, for the Duke Law School and for doing this job. And his brother, who I know quite well, John, is here. John is famous for not only for being a great lawyer, and also, like David, the son of the former president of the University of Chicago, and the dean of the law school at the University of Chicago, where I went to law school. But you're most famous for introducing Barack Obama to Michelle. So you didn't get a finder's fee for that, no? So how many people here are lawyers? Okay? How many people here are judges? How many are law professors? How many people wish they had listened to their mother and gone to medical school instead? Anybody? Okay. So I went to law school, and I want to talk about three things. My legal career, which I know you're saying, why would I want to hear from somebody who isn't really a legal scholar, not really practicing law, and never was a judge and never could be? But I want to tell you about why I'm so glad I went to law school. The second thing I want to talk about is patriotic philanthropy, which is what David was alluding to. And the third thing is a little bit about some legal documents that aren't really legal documents that have a binding effect on the law, but they're very important to the law. And those legal documents, not unlike the restatement and the codes that you do at the ALI, they might not be binding legal documents, but they have enormous effect on the law. So those are the three subjects. First, my legal career. I grew up, like many of you in my era, wanted to be a lawyer because I thought that's what people in government often did. I grew up in Baltimore. Baltimore is a place where I was rigidly segregated by religion, and every place in certain areas of Baltimore you couldn't sell a house to somebody who was Jewish or black, so all the Jews lived in a very narrow area of Baltimore. And my parents didn't graduate from college or law school, so I didn't really have the benefit that you might get if you have parents that have those kind of attributes, but my parents had unconditional love for their only child. And so I grew up thinking, what can I do to help get where I want to go? And then I heard John Kennedy's great speech, his inaugural address. Some of you may be old enough to remember this, on January 20th, 1961, where John Kennedy said, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And my sixth grade teacher went over that with me line by line, word for word, and I realized it was poetry in prose form. And it really inspired me to say, look, I know what I want to do. I want to go into government, help my country. And I was explaining this to my teacher, and she said, well, you should be a lawyer. And I didn't really know what lawyers were. There were no lawyers in my family, but I just resolved that I would try to do that. So ultimately, I went to Duke University and on a scholarship, not a basketball scholarship, I assure you. I was cut from an intramural basketball team at Duke, which is hard to do, when there were only 4 other people on the team, too. So I wanted to go to law school, and I did okay to get into law school. I wasn't a great superstar student, but enough to get into law school. And I applied to a lot of law schools, and I got into law schools that I applied to. And then I applied to one that I didn't really know, University of Chicago. And the University of Chicago Law School had a program to get people from the East Coast, I guess, to come to the Midwest, and they called it a National Honor Scholarship. They give you a full ride. So I said, wow, this is great. My parents didn't really have any money, and I didn't have any money either. So they said, send in your $50, and you get the scholarship to reserve your place. Then next day I got a letter saying, send in your $50, reserve your place in a dorm, if you want a dorm, a law school dorm. I said, okay, but I don't actually have an extra $50. It was a lot of money to me then. So I sent them the $50 to the law school dorm people saying, surely they'll tell the law school I'm coming, because why would I need a dorm? That logic, which I got from my Duke logic course, didn't actually work. So I showed up the first day and said, here I am, David Rubenstein, full scholarship recipient. Then they said, well, you didn't send your $50. Your scholarship money went elsewhere. So I'm ready to cry. I said, wait a second, I sent them $50 to the law school dorm people. What would I be needing the dorm for if I'm not going to law school? They said, that's a different department of the university. We don't know anything about it. We never talked to them. So I'm getting ready to cry and call my parents and say, I'm not going to be a lawyer. I can't get into law school. The scholarship went away. Finally, they didn't want somebody crying. So they said, okay, we reconfigure the money. You can have it. Okay. So I'm so grateful that I've given them $36 million in scholarship money to make up for it. So. So I went to law school, and the reason I'm happy I went to the University of Chicago Law School, and it was a great law school. It had great legal scholars. I remember my professors were Phil Curlin and Grant Gilmore and Soya Menchikoff, among others. And I had one professor I didn't really think was very good, though, initially. It taught me first year of torts, and he wanted to teach something called the economic theory of torts. And I said, oh my God, I am going to be in trouble. I'm not going to pass. So I went up to him and said, listen, professor, I have to take the bar exam in a couple years, and this economic theory of torts is not going to enable me to get past the bar exam. So can you teach us what torts are, not your economic theory? That was Richard Posner. And he didn't pay attention to what I said. So I was an okay law school student, but not a great one. And the good thing about going to law school at the University of Chicago is I thought I was very smart. When I got there, I realized I wasn't quite that smart. If I had been much smarter, I would have wound up as judge or a law professor. And I wouldn't have been able to buy the Magna Carta. So I don't regret it. But so I did well enough to get on the law review, and I think I got on the law review because I had to write things out in longhand. I didn't really type very well, so I wrote it out in longhand, and I was convinced the professors probably couldn't read my writing, but they gave me the benefit of the doubt. So I got good enough grades to get on the law review. And getting on the law review got me an opportunity to get an interview for my law school job between second and third year. You all remember between the second and third year you can get a job. It's hard for those who were younger, but it was an enormously high-paying summer job. You got paid $300 a week. The starting salary was then $15,000 a year, but some firms were flirting with going to $16,000 or $17,000. And so I got a summer job at the ultimate firm in New York, the ultimate Wall Street firm. They were impressed that I was on law review. It was Cravath, Swaine & Moore. All of you may have heard of it. So here I am. I'm from Baltimore. My father's a blue-collar worker. I'd never been to Wall Street, but I'm so excited. I told my parents, but they didn't know Cravath, Swaine & Moore from anything. They'd never heard of it. So I get there, and I only had one suit. I was my leftover from my bar mitzvah. I had it still. And I went out and bought two more suits. But then I went out and bought 10 white shirts, buttoned down. And the first day I get into Cravath, Swaine & Moore, I'm sharing an office with a permanent associate. And his name, I'll never forget it, was a fairly waspy firm. It wasn't, I'd say, a Jewish firm. His name was R. Tony Snodgrass III. His real name was R. Francis Snodgrass III, but his nickname was Tony. And I figured it was a little waspier than I didn't know any Snodgrasses IIIs when I was growing up in Baltimore. So first day I introduced myself to R. Francis Snodgrass III, and I say, I'm sharing the office with you. And he said, okay. And so I took off my jacket, and he said, what the hell is that? I said, what do you mean? He said, I've never seen a short-sleeved white shirt. I said, what do you mean? It's the summer. What do you mean it's summer? My father always wears short sleeve shirts in the summer. He says, yes, but that might be the post office. We have air conditioning here. I said, oh. So I had to go throw all my short sleeve shirts out and get long sleeve. But okay, I did okay. I got an offer to go back, but I wasn't sure I was really going to make it as a partner there because the only two Jewish partners there were the sons of federal judges, Judge Rifkin and Judge Rosenman. And I thought, if you have to have a father who's a federal judge to be a partner, I'm probably not going to make it because my father wasn't quite in that league. So I didn't go there. I decided to go ultimately to another law firm called Paul, Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison. And it was an unusual firm because in those days it was half Jewish and half not Jewish. But the reason I really wanted to go there was that the man who wrote that great inaugural address for John Kennedy was there, Ted Sorensen, maybe the greatest presidential speechwriter of all time. And I went there and I said, okay, now I'm going to be, I wasn't good enough to be a law professor and I wasn't good enough to be a Supreme Court clerk or a clerk, but I'd be good enough to be a good corporate lawyer. And so I went there and I started practicing and, eventually I wanted to work for Ted Sorensen and so forth. And I said, in effect, when I went there the first time, I want to go practice corporate law, but ultimately I want to go to the White House and work in the government like you did and help the country. And he looked skeptically at that. And then eventually, after a couple years of doing this, he was encouraged by the other partners to help me get a job outside of Paul Weiss. And I told my clients, someday I'm going to go to the White House. And they said, not soon enough. Could you leave soon? So I really realized I wasn't a great lawyer. And so, this is the advantage of not being a great lawyer. If you're not a great lawyer, you have to do something else. Now, my real goal was to go to work in the White House. I did get a job working the Carter campaign for President Carter. And when I joined his campaign in 1976, he was 33 points ahead of Gerald Ford. When I was finished, Carter won by 1 point. So people often say, what was your role? And Carter said, you really helped me that much? But anyway, as we have observed recently and many times, the best jobs in the White House are not filled necessarily by people who on merit. They're filled by people who might have worked in the campaign. So there I was, 27 years old. I'm the Deputy Domestic Policy Advisor to the President of the United States, a job I wasn't qualified for, but I figured Carter wasn't qualified either. He didn't know anything, I didn't know anything, though by today's standards, he's extremely well experienced. So, as David pointed out, one of my jobs is to fight inflation. I got it to 18%, which nobody's done since, and I haven't been invited back to government since that time. But many lawyers I had an office in the West Wing, and many lawyers came to see me all the time, and they'd say, you're a bright young man, and when you ever want a job, call me up. I said, well, look, I'm going to be here for the second term. Like Ted Sorensen, I'm going to be the senior advisor in the domestic policy in the second term for Carter, so I don't really need a job, but thank you for being nice to me. Well, I said, the second term, and by the way, I said, but for the second term, we want to run against a man named Ronald Reagan because he's so old. He was 69. I'm 68 now. 68 to me seems like a teenager now, but then he seemed like I thought he was ready for a nursing home. 69, I thought, how could we lose to him? Well, as you may remember, we lost. So the next day, I called all the lawyers who told me how bright I was and they wanted to hire me, and nobody hired me. Nobody would call me back. And it was getting to be embarrassing because after the transition was over and we lost, and we left office on January 20th of 1981, my mother said, well, David, which law firm do you want to go to? And I said, well, I have so many to pick from, I don't know which one to take. Well, that was January, February, March, April, May, June. Around July, somebody felt sorry for me. I got a job practicing law, and the same pattern happened again. My client said, how much longer are you going to do this? And my partner said, you sure you're really cut out for the practice of law? So the good thing was, because I wasn't a very good lawyer, I managed to get out of the practice of law. And if I'd been a very good lawyer, I'd be practicing law now, but all of my classmates who are practicing law, they've all been forced out of their law firms because of the certain age requirements you often have in law firms. So all of my classmates are pretty much done practicing law. So I'm glad I got out of the practice of law because I wasn't very good at it. I ultimately, because I decided to start an investment firm, I started the first private equity firm in Washington, and it grew to be one of the largest in the world. And so I got very, very lucky. And because of that luck, I wanted to give back to society. And when the Forbes magazine one time pointed out my net worth, I realized I need to do something with this. So, when you have a lot of money, what do? Well, you can do what the ancient pharaohs did. You can take it all and be buried with it and, build a pyramid. There's no evidence you need it in the afterlife, so I decided I wasn't going to do that. You can give it to your children, but there's no evidence that giving each child $1 billion necessarily makes this child a better person, so I figured I wasn't going to do that, and my children may not have liked that idea, but I didn't think that was a good idea. So then in the end, what you're going to do with the money? You give it away while you're alive or upon your death, and I thought when I died, if I waited till that time to give it away, I would maybe not be in a place where I could see my executor giving it away, so I wasn't sure where I'd be going. So I decided to give it away in my lifetime, and then I was called by Bill Gates, and he said, I'm starting the Giving Pledge, where you say you're going to give away half your money during your lifetime or upon your death. I said, I'll tell you what, I'm going to give away all my money. So I'm happy to sign the Giving Pledge, and I did. And then I did many things that many people typically do, which is to give money to schools and education and medical research, and I've done a fair amount of that, and most of my philanthropy does go into education and medical research. But then I stumbled onto something that really changed my path in philanthropy, and it's something I've coined the phrase for called patriotic philanthropy, and this is what it really is. I have realized that our country doesn't really understand our history very well. We don't really know the good and the bad of our history as much as we should. Now, evidence of this is overwhelming. For example, in a recent survey by Annenberg Foundation, it turns out that 3/4 of Americans cannot name the 3 branches of government. 3/4 of Americans cannot name the 3 branches of government. Turns out that more than 30% of Americans, more than 36% of Americans cannot name a single right protected by the First Amendment. It turns out that about 60% of Americans regard Thomas Jefferson as the father of the Constitution when he wasn't even at the Constitutional Convention. Only 20% of Americans can identify James Madison as the father of the Constitution. 35% of Americans, when asked who was the first Treasury Secretary, say not Alexander Hamilton, but Larry Summers. More high school sophomores can name the first 3 names of the 3 Stooges than the first 3 names of any founding fathers. And hard to believe, but 10%, almost 10%, 9.6% of college graduates believe that Judge Judy is on the United States Supreme Court. Now, she's not yet there. So why is this? Well, it's for a couple reasons. One, we don't teach civics in high school or junior high very much anymore. You can graduate from 80% of the colleges in the United States today and not have to take a single course in American history or American government. And even if you're a history major at almost any college in this country, you can graduate as a history major without taking a course in American history. I am convinced that most people who are native-born Americans, if they were asked to take, without studying, the citizenship test that immigrants have to take, they couldn't pass it. And the result of this is not good. Now, George Santayana, a famous Harvard economist, once said, "Those who don't remember history are condemned to relive it." And I think he was right, because if you don't know the good and the bad of history, you're probably going to make mistakes in the future again. So I don't really think necessarily that I can make a big difference by myself, but what I've tried to do is buy some historic documents that came into my way, and I'll describe in a moment how that happened, and then put them on display where at say, the Smithsonian, the archives, Mount Vernon, other places that lots of people are going to go to see them. Now, why is it important to see the historic documents? Well, it turns out that the human brain hasn't yet evolved so that you treat a historic document the same way you treat it seeing on a computer slide. In other words, you can go on a computer and look at the Magna Carta. But usually what happens is you look at it and you go on to the next slide. You don't think about it. If you go to visit the original of the Magna Carta, you will actually spend more time on it. Your parents might tell you about it if you're a child. If you're an adult, you might spend more time learning about it before you go there. And as a result of seeing the historic documents, my theory is you might learn more about American history, and therefore we might have a more informed society. We have a more informed society, we might have a better democracy. And so I applied the same principle to certain other things. When the Washington Monument had its earthquake damage, I called the head of the Park Service, who I knew, and said, "How long is it going to take you to fix it?" He says, "It's going to take a couple years. I get the money from Congress, dealing with them. It's going to take forever." I said, "I'll tell you what, I'll put up the money, fix it, and just get it done." And so I did that, and I realized that how important the Washington Monument is to so many people. And so when other historic buildings needed to be fixed, like Monticello or Montpelier, James Madison's home, or the Custis Lee Mansion at the top of Arlington, or the Iwo Jima Memorial, or Lincoln Memorial, as these things were crumbling, I realized that they didn't have enough money, or the federal government wasn't going to put up the money. So if I could help fix them up, more people would come to visit them. More people come to visit them, more people will learn about our country, the good and the bad. So like, for example, in Monticello, I insisted when they redid Monticello that they build out the slave quarters because I wanted to make sure everybody knew that Thomas Jefferson, for all of his great virtues, was a slave owner. And the same is true with James Madison. If you visit Montpelier and you go to visit Monticello, you'll see the slave quarters have been built out. So people can learn that we had this terrible birth defect. We're still living with this birth defect called slavery. But I want people to learn the good and the bad. Hopefully it'll produce better citizens. So I got into this, what I've called patriotic philanthropy. And it's now, while it's a modest part of the money I give away, it gets a lot of attention. The reason it gets attention is, unfortunately, not many people are doing this. If I give $100 million to medical research, it might be a good thing, but lots of people are giving more to that, and it doesn't get any attention. If I give $13 million to fix up the Washington Monument or $20 million to fix up the Lincoln Memorial, it gets attention, unfortunately, because nobody else is doing these things. So I'm trying to do this not to get my attention for myself, but to get other people, other wealthy people and non-wealthy people to say, we should give back to our country. And all of you should think about this yourself. All of you, if you're in this room, you're very fortunate. You're obviously in the 1/10 of 1%, and while you may not be in the Forbes 400, you obviously have done well in this country. And so all of you can give back, and I like to remind people that philanthropy is an ancient Greek word that means loving humanity. It doesn't mean rich people writing checks. So you can love humanity by giving your time, your energy, your ideas, or your money if you have it. But when you give your time, that's the most precious thing, because that's the only thing we can't recover. We can always make more money, we can always come new ideas. You can't recover the time. So that's a very precious thing. And I try to ask everybody, and I ask all of you to think tonight, what is it that you're doing that you would say when you are towards the end of your life, you would want to say to your spouse, your partner, your children, this is what I did to give back to the country. It made it possible for me to do very good things with my life. So just think about what you would like people to say about what you've done to give back to this country. Now let me, as you're thinking about this, let me talk about 3 documents that are like the restatement in some ways, 3 documents I've been involved with that are not official legal documents at this point, but like the restatement and the model codes, they're influential. The first one is the Magna Carta. So David mentioned that earlier. Now you might say, what is he talking about? How can you own the Magna Carta? I thought that myself. Well, here's what happened. I was invited to go to a viewing of the Magna Carta as I was flying back from London. And I was saying, wait a second, I've been invited to go to a viewing of the Magna Carta. It must be in London. What's it doing over in New York? And what's it doing at Sotheby's? So I get there, and the curator said, as I got there at the last minute, well, actually, it turns out there are 17 different copies of the Magna Carta. There were more or less 4 different versions, 1215, 1216, 1217, 1224, 1225, and also 1297. There were 5 different versions that were done. And it turns out that only 17 remained because they were on parchment. And while there were 36 shires in England, like 36 states or counties, probably 1 was done for each of them. They were on parchment, which was animal skin, and rats and mice like to eat it, and they were lost. So how many of you can find something you filed 40 days ago, let alone 40 years ago, let alone 800 years ago? So these things got lost, they were eaten by animals, they were fires. So only 17 are left. 15 in British institutions, 1 in the Australian Parliament, and then it turned out a family had one in its possession for 500 years, the Brudenell family, and they were going land poor in the early 1980s, so they didn't know what to do. They could give up this piece of parchment, which didn't mean that much to them, one of the versions of the Magna Carta, or they could lose their land. They decided to sell the Magna Carta. Ross Perot sent his lawyer over, Tom Luce, to buy it and preempt an auction. Tom Luce bought it for about $1.25 million, rolled it up in a tube, and then went back through British Customs. They said, what's in that tube, Mr. Luce? He said, oh, the Magna Carta. They said, okay, go ahead through. So he brought it here, and then he put it on display at the National Archives, and then it turned out that Ross Perot decided to sell it, and so at Sotheby's they told me it would probably go to somebody from outside the United States. And I said, well, that's unfortunate because it wasn't drafted in the United States, but it was very important to our country's history, because all of you who know history will know that when our colonial charters were being created in England, they were often created by legal scholars and drafted by them, and most of the colonial charters said that you have the rights of Englishmen, and the rights of Englishmen meant that you had the rights of the Magna Carta. So when we had our disputes with England in 1774, 1775, 1776, many of the colonial leaders said, well, we have the rights of the Magna Carta, and they're not being honored. So the Magna Carta was actually very influential in our decision to break away from England. It may have been more influential in our country's history than actually it was in England's history. And in fact, when our colonial charters were being, our constitutions were being drafted, and our later constitution, many of the rights in the Magna Carta wound up in our own Bill of Rights, our Constitution, and in the state and local constitutions. So it was very influential. So I decided that one copy of the 17 should stay in this country. So I decided I didn't want to tell my family I'm going to go buy the Magna Carta tomorrow. It sounds presumptuous. And I didn't want to tell my children. They might say, how much less money might this mean for us? I don't know. So I just went back. I changed my schedule to go back the next night and try to buy it. Now, I'd never been an art collector. I didn't know Sotheby's. So I went there, and they put me in a little room, and they pick up a telephone. They say, just listen, you'll listen to bidding. I couldn't hear that well, and they started bidding. And if you've ever been in an auction, you get carried away. And so finally, people started bidding, and I started bidding and bidding and bidding. Finally, they said, sold. So I couldn't hear who won. So the head of Sotheby's came in and said, hey, you just bought the Magna Carta. Who are you? I said, well, I told him who I was. He says, by the way, you have the money for this? We don't know who you are. I said, okay. So I said, yes. And he said, well, look, you can slip out the side door with the Magna Carta. Nobody will know. Or you can go down to these reporters that are here, and there are 100 reporters. They want to know. So I said, I'll tell them what I'm going to do. I'll tell them who I am. So I went there and said, look, I came from very modest circumstances, and I want to give back to my country. So I'm going to give this to the United States government, put it in the National Archives forever as a down payment on my obligation to give back to this country. And so if you go to the National Archives, you'll see it there, and it's a wonderful monument to not only what humans came up with as a way to kind of get the rights for all citizens, but it's something that reminds us of our history. And I think when I did that, I went right afterwards to the dinner at the president of Citicorp's house, Chuck Prince, and I said, I'm sorry I'm late. I just bought the Magna Carta, so I'm a little late. He says, oh, sure. Well, he called me the next morning. He said, David, it's in the front page of the New York Times. You bought the Magna Carta. I thought you were kidding. Nobody's ever come to my house before and said they bought the Magna Carta. So, all right, so, and of course, the next couple of days, I started getting offers of people who wanted me to buy their Magna Carta. And I said, geez, I thought I had the only one in private hands. But it turns out there are a lot of fake copies out there. So I have a standard letter, and I just say I don't want to corner the market in Magna Carta, so I don't buy any more of them. But that led me to buy another historic document, the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence, the original Declaration of Independence. Now think about this. What happened is when we were in the Second Continental Congress, there was an effort to maybe break away from England. It wasn't certain whether there was enough support for it. So John Adams had a resolution proposed in the Second Continental Congress that said to the delegates, go back to your state legislatures and get authority to vote on whether we should break away or not. They didn't have the authority. So they went back, and they came back at the end of June, and 12 of the states were there. New York was being invaded by the British, and so they weren't really there at the Second Continental Congress. And they decided to vote on this resolution. Should we break away or not break away? And they had to vote on July the 2nd. And on July the 2nd, they voted to break away. So John Adams then wrote to Abigail Adams and said, this will be the day we remember forever in history. It's July the 2nd because we voted to break away. So at the end of July the 2nd, when they voted to be separate from England, they wanted to explain why they were doing so. Now, what they came up with was a propaganda document. It had no legal effect at all. It's not anything but a propaganda document. And interestingly, like all of us, the man who was given this task procrastinated perhaps. What they did is they had a committee of 5 people: John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman. And they were told, draft up a declaration that will explain why we're going to break away, assuming we vote to break away. And so this assignment was given to Thomas Jefferson and he was one of the 5, but John Adams said, look, I'm the most senior member of this Congress, but you are in the most junior one, but you're the best writer, so you write it. And Thomas Jefferson was given 17 days to write this. He waited the last 3 days. He was busy. They all had committees to be on. So he sat down with 2 slaves who were attending him, and in an un-air-conditioned apartment, obviously, that he had rented. He started writing it out. Now, he didn't have any books with him. He wrote it out, and he wrote out 3 parts: the preamble, all the things that King George had done that were sins in his view, and then what we're going to do, break away. Well, the most important part was the sins of King George. The preamble was ignored because it was just preliminary language, and what we were going to do, break away, was known. So when the delegates voted on July the 2nd to say we're going to break away, they then took up the document that Thomas Jefferson approved by the committee of the 5 that I mentioned. They took up the document. And the preamble, they spent very little time on it. It turns out they ignored that, but it turns out that it has the most famous sentence in the English language, We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Nobody really paid attention to that. It ultimately became the most famous sentence in the English language because it ultimately became the creed of America. All men are created equal. Now, obviously, we had slavery. We didn't treat all men equal. We obviously didn't treat women equal. But Thomas Jefferson, who lived another 50 years after that document was written, never actually explained what he meant by all men are created equal. We believe that he meant that all people are equal in some sense, but obviously he didn't believe that blacks and whites could live together. He didn't really think that there should be equality in that sense. But that sentence, that all men are created equal, became really the creed of our country. And when Abraham Lincoln wrote the famous Gettysburg Address, that's what he was referring to. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And he was referring back to Thomas Jefferson. And the idea that all men are created equal was not what the Civil War was initially fought for in the view of the North, but it ultimately became what it was all about and what the country was supposedly achieving as its principal goal. Well, on that day when they took it up on July the 2nd, the Continental Congress, they ultimately changed the documentation, the document that Thomas Jefferson had written dramatically. In fact, he said they had mutilated it. He mutilated it so much that he refused for 9 years to admit that he was the author of it because he was embarrassed. In fact, he was like a little child. He sent letters later on to people saying, this was my version, this is what the Continental Congress did, don't you think my version's better? Ultimately, of course, he later was proud of it, and on his tombstone, he insisted that author of the Declaration of Independence be put there first. Well, what happened was this. After they agreed on the text, they changed his part. One of the main things they took out of his Declaration of Independence, he said that King George was responsible for the slave trade. Well, that was taken out. Why? Because many of these people were slave owners, and they didn't want to mention slavery ever, so they took it out. Thomas Jefferson sat there mute while they were changing his document. He said they mutilated it, but he was not a person who liked to speak in public. When he was President of the United States, he only made one public speech in 8 years. He had a high-pitched voice. He was uncomfortable as a public speaker. So he sat there. They changed it. Then they said, we've got to print up this version that we've now agreed to. They went next door to Mr. Dunlop and a printer, and they said, print up 100 copies of this text. So he read the changes that were agreed to. He printed up 100 copies. And one was sent to King George, one was sent to George Washington to read the troops, one was sent to each of the states. There are about 11 or 12 of these left. They're very valuable. And one time, you may recall that a man named Norman Lear bought one that had been found in an attic. And it was a brilliant first copy of it. No signatures then because they hadn't signed anything. This was the text. He bought it, and then Norman Lear put it on display. He went around the country with it on a bus, and it showed everybody the birth certificate of the United States. The first printing in July, it was printed on July the 5th, the first printing of the text that had been agreed to by the Continental Congress. Later, he agreed to sell it, and Sotheby's was asked to sell it. They sold it through a private sale. One day, Norman Lear called me shortly after the private sale. He said, David, I don't know who bought this document, but did you buy it? Because they didn't tell me. I said, no, it wasn't me. Well, not too long afterwards, I went to somebody's house, and I saw what I knew was Norman Lear's copy of the perfect copy of the Dunlop printing. And I said to the owner of the house, did you spend the $25 million? And I know that Sotheby's got somebody to pay for this. And he said, no, I wouldn't spend $25 million for a document as important as it is. No, I didn't do that. It's not me. The next day, he sent me an email saying, I forgot, I did buy it. It's Bill Gates, and it's in his house. So today, now what happened then, after that was printed, by the way, is the Founding Fathers came back on August the 4th. By that time, New York State had agreed to secede from England, and all the people signed it. John Hancock put his famous signature on it. That original copy with the signatures is now in the archives, and if you go there, though, unfortunately it's faded because it was wrapped up many different ways. It was folded. It was put on display one time, 30 years on display in the sunlight, so it's faded beyond recognition. Fortunately, when John Quincy Adams was Secretary of State, he knew that his father had been responsible in part for this document. He said, I want to have a perfect copy. So he got a printer in Washington to make 200 perfect copies of the original Declaration of Independence. It had a wet cloth process. We don't really know the details of it. Put it on the original, took half the ink off, put it on a copper plate. They printed 200 copies. So when you see the New York Times on July the 4th, you see a copy of the Declaration of Independence with all its signatures. That is a copy that is really called a stone copy, and I own a number of them and put them on display. So that's really the best document that shows what's in it because the original is so faded. So let me get to the third and final document. And I should say this, by the way, the reason we celebrate the 4th of July and not the 2nd of July is this. John Adams said he wanted to celebrate the 2nd of July, and that's probably the more important date. Thomas Jefferson, who drafted the Declaration, obviously thought when it was agreed to on July the 4th, that was the more important date. Well, what happened was July the 2nd was agreed as the more significant date at the time, but when July the 2nd, 1777 came around, the Second Continental Congress was still meeting, they forgot. They forgot to celebrate. They didn't get around to it 2 days later, so they celebrated the 4th of July, and ever since we've been celebrating the 4th of July. But that was a source of dispute between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson for 50 years, because Adams thought July 2nd was more important. Obviously, Thomas Jefferson thought July the 4th was more important. Final document, the Emancipation Proclamation. Abraham Lincoln refused to really say early on that he supported the emancipation of slaves. In fact, this is hard to believe, but when James Buchanan was President of the United States, he proposed and got Congress to agree to a 13th Amendment which said that slavery is the law of the land and can never be changed. That was the original 13th Amendment. And Lincoln, in his first inaugural address, said, I support that. Because Lincoln really was not an abolitionist. He was basically a person who wanted to keep the Union together. Ultimately, his effort to keep the Union together failed. The war wasn't going well. Ultimately, he had to find some way to break the Southern war machine. One of the ways to do it was to get rid of the slave labor that was helping the South. So he did something that was very creative. He said there are war powers in the Constitution, and under the War Powers Act, I'm going to issue an Emancipation Proclamation freeing those slaves who were subject to the Southern rule. Well, it turned out that this was not very popular with many of his cabinet, who he talked to about it. They asked him to postpone it for a while, at least wait till we're not in a weakened position. Let's at least win a battle somewhere so we can say we're not doing this from a weakened position. But it was a very clever interpretation of the law, which would say I have war powers, and the war powers, I am going to take away the right of Southerners to own slaves. He issued it eventually on January 1, 1863. And on that day, it was a tradition in the United States that you could go in and shake the hand of the President of the United States. So he shook about 5,000 hands that day, January 1, 1863. He then went up to sign the document, and his hands were like this. And because it was, he'd shaken so many hands. So he had to steady his hand because he said, I don't want people to see that my hand is shaking. They'll think I don't really mean what I'm saying in the Emancipation. He issued it. It didn't really free many slaves because it only freed the slaves who were subject to Southern rule. Those slaves in the border states were not covered because we weren't at war with them, and that was 500,000 of the slaves. So very few slaves were actually covered, and maybe only, some people say 20,000, 50,000 slaves were freed. But it's a document that became the symbol of the need to free slaves. And when the war was over, since the Emancipation Proclamation only applied to the southern states, that's why Lincoln ultimately fought to have the 13th Amendment, which eliminated slavery completely. So the original of the Emancipation Proclamation is in the archives, and it's very fragile, so it's only taken out once a year where it can be looked at. But Lincoln signed 44 souvenir copies to be sold at $6 a piece, at $10 a piece, to help get money for the equivalent of the Red Cross. Only 6 of them sold at $10 a piece. Now there are about 20 of them left. I own a number of them. I put one of those that I own at the display permanently at the African American History and Culture Museum, and I've also put my copy of the 13th Amendment signed by Lincoln there as well. So these are documents that didn't really, Emancipation Proclamation is not the law, but it kind of led to the 13th Amendment. The Declaration of Independence is a propaganda document, but it's influential, and it has been cited by the Supreme Court in many cases, and obviously the Magna Carta has never been part of our law. But these documents, not unlike the restatements that you do or model codes, are very influential, and I think I'm very proud to be able to have owned these, and I own them really as a custodian. When I die, all these will go to the places that they're now at, or some equivalent place. So anyway, I'd like to conclude by saying that I am glad I wasn't a great lawyer, because I wouldn't have been able to afford to buy these things. I hope all of you will think about what you might be able to do to give back to the country with your time, your energy, your ideas, in addition to what you're doing today and your career, because I think all of us should think about that we are very fortunate to be in this country with all of its flaws and all of its challenges, but it's a country where many of us have risen up from very modest circumstances, and we ought to think about something we can do to give back to the country. So I encourage you all to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. Everybody in the room, at least to this extent, cares about our legal system and is here as a volunteer to help the American democracy thrive through the rule of law. I have it on good authority that Professors Logue and Baker have signed 17 copies of the Restatement of Liability Insurance. And David, they're at Sotheby's right now. Well, we enjoyed the evening. Thank you all very much.